own sheep. Sheep were a far easier animal to look after in the mountains than cattle, and are going to give you the same sorts of resources. So you're going to get your meat, your leather and your milk, but of course you're also going to get wool without having to kill them, so they're a really good animal to have. Now every late spring or early summer they would shear the sheep and harvest the wool, and the first thing you're going to want to do is wash it through thoroughly, like is going on over there, because otherwise you smell like the sheep do in the winter time, and believe me, that's not a pleasant smell for anyone. So once it's nicely washed and dried, you're then going to need to turn this wool into a usable yarn. And the first stage in that is you take a pair of rather intimidating looking combs like so, and you're going to comb all of this wool through thoroughly, because you want all of the fibres to go in the same direction when you have done this. So once you've combed it through for a bit, you're then going to be able to pull some of these fibres through the teeth of the comb, and you're going to keep them overlapped somewhat as you do this, and you're going to end up with a fairly long piece of wool fibre that we call roving, which is what I have here. Now once you've got your roving, you need to spin this. But unfortunately, Vikings are about 200 years before the invention of a spinning wheel. So to spin this into a usable yarn, they would have to use a drop spindle, just like the one I have here. So what you're going to do is you're going to have this hanging like so. You take your roving, you overlap it with any wool you've already got, and you start to spin. And as you spin, you can see the roving gets sucked into the yarn, and then you just move your fingers up, and as you do this you create new yarn, just as I am doing here. Now you can see that this is not a particularly difficult process, but it is going to be very time consuming, and it would take around 600 hours to make just one tunic in the Viking Age. So it's a long process, and if I was to be in the Viking Age myself, this would actually be the job of children. Now we have a lot of long and dark winter nights in Norway, and we didn't exactly have TV or even books to keep kids entertained back then. So what better way of keeping them out of trouble than putting them to use making the yarn to make clothing from later on. So once you have filled a spindle like this many times over, you could then take your yarn over to a loom like the one we have beside me here. And this type of loom predates the Viking Age. You find examples of the same style all the way back as far as the Egyptian period, and using this loom you can make it as long as you like, and when you finish one section you just wrap it around the pole at the top, and then you splice new yarn at the bottom, and you continue weaving until it's your desired length. I will come to that in a few moments. And so the other thing is that you will also find looms that are much larger than this one, and so with those you could make much wider sheets of fabric, and those could be sewn together to make things like sails as an example. But if I was to take this fabric here and make clothing from this, I would probably end up looking like a slave rather than a Viking, because this is very dull and boring when you look at it as it is right now. And so the Vikings, they actually loved bright and vivid colourful clothing, like all of the ones that we have here. And all of these colours were available in the Viking Age, but some were easier to make than others. So green and yellow are two of the easiest colours you could make. You could take practically any green plant growing in the village, and if you boil it up in an iron pot, you will get green dye, and if you do the same in a copper pot, you get yellow dye. But if you wanted blue, red or purple, they're a bit harder to make and therefore more expensive. So to make blue, you would need to have a plant called woad. Now luckily woad grows throughout Norway, so that's not difficult to find. I gather the plant's leaves up and I crush them, and then I need to let them ferment for about 3 weeks in ammonia. Now there's only one source of ammonia in the Viking Age, so to get that I would need to drink a lot and then generate the ammonia into a bucket afterwards. And apparently the more alcohol in your system, the better the ammonia you create. So it's also a good excuse for a party beforehand, and I'm sure this is why the Vikings loved the colour blue as much as they did. Now once you've got your dye, you put your fabric in, and if you do nothing else with it, When you take it out, it will be green, not blue. The secret to turn it blue is you need to heat it up to around 70 degrees centigrade. Now, when it reaches that temperature, it will still look green in the pot, but as soon as you take it out, it will react with oxygen and turn blue in front of your eyes. So it was even seen something like a magical colour to the Vikings who couldn't explain this. Now, unfortunately, if it went above 70 degrees, it would turn grey instead. So it was very difficult to get that precise temperature, especially when you consider that a Viking's thermometer looked like this. And I don't know about you, but I don't really want to put my finger in this pot of ingredients more than I have to. And so that's why blue is expensive. Now, red was even more expensive, because to get a hold of red, the process is basically the same, but you would need a different plant to get the colour, and the plant you need is called madder root, and that does not grow in Scandinavia, but rather towards the Mediterranean. So they had to go to that area of the world to trade for it, and the trade plus travel time makes red dye cost more money. But the most expensive of all colours was purple. Now, there were two ways you could make purple in the Viking Age. One way is a process we call double dyeing, which is where you dye your fabric blue and then red on top, and you get your purple, and probably bankrupt yourself at the same time doing so. The other way you get purple is you get a specific breed of sea snail, and you crush that snail up, and you get a lovely vivid purple dye out of it. Unfortunately, you need about 500 snails for a piece of fabric about this big to be dyed purple, and once again this snail is only found in the Mediterranean, so it's still a very difficult colour to get a hold of. This is why purple in particular was so expensive, but also why all three of those colours are still known as royal colours today. And incidentally, all of these have been made using the original plant dyeing techniques that I have just described. So this is the same colour and vividness that the Vikings themselves would have had. Now, aside from wool, Vikings have other material they make clothing from as well, the second most common being linen. And you get linen from this plant here, which is called flax. Now, luckily, this plant will grow throughout all of Scandinavia, and Norway included, but in Norway at least it grows, if anything, a little bit too well. If you have this growing near to a field full of crops to eat, you're going to quickly find this takes over the entire field, and then you'll have some very nice clothing, but you'll be starving hungry all the time. So the Vikings tended not to grow so much of that here in Norway, and rather traded for it from nearby countries. Now, this does make the yarn, the linen cost a little bit more, but it's not vastly more expensive. So anybody could have it, it's just not necessarily going to be someone rich enough to have it dyed different colours. Of course, if someone tried to overcharge a Viking for linen, well, they had their own methods of cost cutting, so that wasn't something they had to worry about all that often. But the rarest and most expensive material of the Vikings was silk. Now, the Vikings would get silk from a place which they called Miklagard, which everybody else called Constantinople or Istanbul as we know it today. But 2 meters of silk was equivalent to a horse or a slave in value. So this was incredibly expensive. And so most people could not afford any silk at all. And even if you could get it, it was usually only used in the form of embroidery rather than as an entire garment. So if you saw someone wearing an entire tunic of silk, they were probably the king or jarl or related to them at the very least. So you could tell just by looking at someone how wealthy that person was, and probably powerful, simply from the colouring and materials their clothes were made of. So that's just a little bit about the textiles of the Vikings. And of course we can't leave it there, because the Vikings are well known for a certain other area, and that was for their brutality. And so we're going to take a little bit of a look at some of the tools and weapons used by their warriors. And for this we're going to just head to the house next door, and I'll tell you all about this when we get there.